So, a nation fallen from its former glory stands alone. At its gates lay the vast armies of evil. Day and night fiery destruction rains down from above. Their former leaders prove useless, and their only hope is an aging man with an ability to pull off some fairly neat speeches, to be fair. Into its gates come streaming the remnants of other forces that have been smashed and driven before the oncoming tide. Then, as all hope seems lost, on the horizon come the banners of allies and friends in one last stand together against the darkness. Well, that's the setup for the Battle of Pelennor Fields anyways, but what's that got to do with naval history? Well, actually, the parallels can certainly be drawn, and they're far from coincidental. But we're going to focus on one part of that, the smaller nations whose militaries were smashed and driven away from their homelands. Did they keep up the fight? How? With who? And of course, what had to be done to organise them into a coherent fighting force? There is, of course, no one simple answer to this, as different forces showed up at different times and in different strengths. But we're going to try and give a brief overview of those displaced nations whose naval and other forces ended up continuing the fight against the Axis powers. For obvious reasons, we won't be covering the Royal Canadian, Royal Australian, Royal New Zealand, etc. navies, as they already had pre-existing plans and structures in place to work with the Royal Navy in times of war, and were also not overrun by the enemy. Whereas the other forces which we will look at were forced into the situation through circumstances beyond their control. We also won't be covering navies such as the Brazilian, Portuguese, etc. navies, since these retained their national territory and thus were able to operate fully under their own chains of command. A brief roll of honour then, in approximate chronological order, to the Polish, Dutch, Belgian, Norwegian, Free French, Greek-Hellenic, and Yugoslav navies, as well as any others that I may have inadvertently missed. The first and most obvious one to cover would be the Polish Navy, as they were the first to find themselves in this particular situation. Whilst it was a relatively small service, the Polish Navy had seen something of the writing on the wall, and in March 1939, before war actually broke out, had come to an agreement with Britain on basing some of the small Polish fleet in the UK in the event of conflict. Thus, even before Britain declared war on Germany, 3 Polish destroyers, Błyskawica, the Lightning, Grom, Thunder, and Börze, Tempest, turned up at the Firth of Forth. With some Polish ships being lost in combat in the Baltic and others being interned in Sweden, this small force would account for almost all remaining Polish naval forces available, even by the beginning of September 1939. They would be supplemented by the submarines Wilk, or Wolf, and Orzel, or Eagle, the latter of which only arrived after a series of escapades that are best covered in its own video at some point. However, at this stage it was still very much a case of the Polish Navy operating from an Allied base. But with Poland in the process of being overrun, by November 1939 an Anglo-Polish naval agreement was signed. It agreed that the Polish naval detachment was to be commanded by Polish officers, its ships manned by Polish crews, with Polish uniforms and rank distinctions, and of course subject to Polish regulation. But this whole organisation would be subordinated to the operational control of the British Admiralty. The ships themselves would remain, as all warships flying their national flag are, sovereign territory of their original nation. Whilst taking a number of losses early in the war, these losses were made good by transferring various ships to Polish control, assisted by more Polish servicemen making their way to the UK, and other Poles who happened to be outside of Poland at the time enlisting. This would allow them to man the former HMS Garland, 2 French patrol craft, and a couple of French submarine chasers that had been left in British ports by French crews who were unwilling to continue the fight. These would be the Medoc, the Pomerol, CH-11 and CH-12, along with about a dozen Belgian trawlers, usefully named P1 to P12, very original thinking there whoever did that, as well as the French destroyer Ouragan, very briefly as the Free French eventually asked for it back, Hms Nerissa, a destroyer that was renamed to Piron, or Thunderbolt, and HMS Myrmidon, which was renamed to Orkan, or Hurricane. The Polish did seem to have quite the flair for naming their destroyers. As well as this, the light cruisers Dragon and Danae, the latter being renamed to Conrad, which is possibly a slightly less inspiring name, as well as 3 Hunt-class escort destroyers and a few other smaller warships, all ended up flying the Polish flag. With these growing forces gradually becoming available to them, the Polish Navy was actually able to establish 2 commands, north and south, although in operational terms many Polish vessels were seconded to existing Royal Navy formations. It was one such secondment that would see ORP Piron engage the battleship Bismarck in the night before its final encounter with King George V and Rodney, flashing the signal "I am a Pole" at the hapless German battleship the entire time, as well as causing some concern with the rest of its squadron mates, who were fairly certain that Piron was determined to ram the German battleship, since it kept darting far too close for everybody else's tastes, and was noted to have managed to get into such a range that even its light anti-aircraft armament was able to chuck a few shells the Germans' way. Polish ships, it will come as something of less than a surprise, were highly motivated to strike back at the Germans, and they were often noted for their headlong rush into action, with a bravery sometimes bordering on recklessness, as exemplified by the previous example, but that was hardly the only case. In 1942, the first Sea Lord, Sir Dudley Pound, went on record as saying to some of Polish submarine crews who were being decorated for bravery, unsurprisingly, at the time, "Last night I asked my Chief of Staff to give me a list of all Polish warships fighting alongside the Royal Navy. I was shocked to learn how few they are, because in all the dispatches of naval operations and major engagements, I almost always find the name of a Polish ship that distinguished itself." Polish crew also served aboard British warships in small numbers. For example, 4 such men were serving aboard HMS Hood when it was destroyed at the Battle of the Denmark Strait. Thus, whilst operationally under the command of the Royal Navy, the Polish Navy was large enough and well motivated enough to continue to exist as an official, independent and continuous entity that happened to be serving alongside its allies. The Dutch Navy was a slightly different story. Starting out stronger in numbers, and with some overseas colonies, it remained an independent Allied force even after the fall of the Netherlands itself, due to other Dutch territory allowing a physical independent entity to exist in practice as well as in theory, albeit that the Dutch government in exile and their new naval headquarters were based in the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, the Battle of the Java Sea saw the eastern Dutch colonies taken under new management, and a good portion of the remaining Dutch Navy sunk almost at the same time. The much reduced force would, like the Polish Navy, remain under its own flag and receive various ships transferred from the Royal Navy into Dutch service, amounting to a cruiser, 3 destroyers, 2 submersibles, 22 motor torpedo boats, and 24 miscellaneous smaller ships, as well as providing crews for a number of escort and merchant aircraft carriers that would nevertheless retain the British flag most of the time. This was helped out by occasional late arrivals, such as a Dutch ship that sneaked out of Japanese-held territory by pretending to be an island. But, in a difference with the Polish Navy, once the Dutch East Indies had fallen, Dutch ships generally were incorporated into Royal Navy formations under the direct control of the British Admiralty, albeit, as said, retaining their crews and flag with the consent of the Dutch government in exile, with the British also taking the opportunity to acquire some of the advanced technologies found on some of the Dutch ships that had escaped German occupation, such as stabilised 40mm Bofors mounts that were found aboard a Dutch destroyer, which significantly increased the lethality of the 40mm guns themselves. The Dutch forces seem to have not been overly perturbed with the reduction of Dutch territory to a handful of Caribbean islands, and Admiral Conrad Helfrich became known as Ship-a-Day Helfrich by the Allies due to the highly aggressive and lethal submarine campaign that he almost immediately launched against Japanese shipping in the opening stages of the Pacific part of the Second World War, managing to outdo the results of both the Royal and United States navies for a considerable portion of time. The Belgian Navy, by contrast, was, to be honest, pretty small to begin with, and lost pretty much all of its fleet in the German advance, although a good chunk of the Belgian Naval Corps itself managed to skedaddle right before the occupation rolled in. They showed up on British shores with the express wish of continuing the fight against the Germans. However, unlike the Dutch and Polish navies, since they didn't come with their own remnant fleet or command structure, they were instead incorporated into the Belgian section of the Royal Navy. This was set up, and the Belgian Naval Corps members, as well as any Belgians in the area who wanted to join up at the time, were then enlisted into this particular section. This allowed them to crew a pair of corvettes and a number of minesweepers alongside a small number of Royal Navy officers and men. Although nominally assigned to the Free Belgian forces, the ships would retain the HMS designation, as opposed to taking on their own national appellation such as ORP or HNLMS. The Norwegian Navy would end up sitting somewhere between the Polish and Dutch navies, turning up on the UK coast with a baker's dozen of mostly old ships that had managed to survive the German invasion. They would establish their own admiralty and government in exile, and then set about expanding the Norwegian forces, again largely with British-built craft, starting out with motor torpedo boats and then working their way up through corvettes, escort destroyers, full-size destroyers, and conversions of various Norwegian-flagged trawlers, whalers, and other similar vessels, which were exceptionally useful for minesweeping, coastal escort, and sub-hunting operations, since a large number of these vessels had actually been off in the Arctic when the Germans had invaded, and so could be recalled directly to British shores. The strong hulls and bluff shapes of the ships, designed to withstand the occasional Arctic pack ice, made them very durable for these kinds of operations. Accounting for wartime losses, the Norwegian Navy would grow to a surprisingly large 58 ships by the time of the end of the war, and would operate under the overall control of the Royal Navy, but in a mix of command types. Some formations, like 30th Motor Torpedo Boat Flotilla, were wholly Norwegian, whilst in other cases individual units crewed by Norwegian Navy crew members were incorporated into existing Royal Navy formations, and the ship in question handed over to Norwegian command, but otherwise it would continue to operate as part of that formation. This would, for example, lead to HNOMS Stord being part of the destroyer flotilla that helped to sink the battleship Scharnhorst. As with many of the free, insert country here, navies, these ships were noted as generally well motivated, highly efficient, and highly aggressive in combat, which is somewhat understandable, since they were of course crewed entirely by people who had faced a choice of living mostly relatively peacefully under occupation, or risking everything to escape, go to another country, and then enlist to fight back against a nation who may never be broken away from occupying their home country. And they'd chosen this choice willingly. A good example was the aforementioned destroyer Stord, which attracted such accolades as, "Please convey to the Commander-in-Chief Norwegian Navy, Stord played a very daring role in the fight, and I am very proud of her," from Admiral Fraser after the Battle of the North Cape. And along with that was, "The Norwegian destroyer Stord carried out the most daring attack of the whole action," from Duke of York's captain. Presumably Stord's crew had read about the Polish Piron and decided that they weren't to be outdone, and similarly executed some very close-range strafing runs on the German battleship in the middle of the night action. Unlike the first two navies, however, the Norwegians would never operate a cruiser during their time based on British soil, concentrating instead on building up large numbers of lighter forces. The Free French forces were potentially the most contentious force of the free naval elements, since, as was all too painfully shown at Mers el-Kebir, partly due to the existence of the Vichy government still occupying a portion of metropolitan France, significant elements of the Marine Nationale did not want to come and fight for or alongside the British. In fact, the Free French Navy started out with precisely one flag officer and one submarine answering de Gaulle's call to arms. However, with a number of additional French men and officers willing to serve in the Free French Navy, they were given access to a number of Marine Nationale ships which had been in British ports at the time of the armistice and had either surrendered or been taken by force. This was supplemented by a variety of British-built ships until in late 1942 the Germans, shockingly, broke their treaty agreement with Vichy France and invaded. This brought the majority of French overseas possessions over to the Free French side, including the battleship Richelieu and a number of cruisers, instantly making the Free French Navy the biggest and most heavily armed of the various Free Nation navies by a considerable margin. Like the Polish Navy, the Free French Navy operated under its own auspices of command within a framework set out by the British Admiralty, although with de Gaulle being who he was, the latitude of the Free French Navy, both in taking part in and suggesting operations to be executed, was perhaps the largest of all the free navies, even before they got their hands on some of the major elements of the pre-war Marine Nationale. However, at an operational level, there was generally a good sense of camaraderie, with one British ship noting that the Hunt-class La Combattante had gone aground in the early morning hours off the D-Day Beaches coast, and promptly signalled the ship, "I am very happy that a French be the first to touch the ground of France." Due to the presence of Vichy French ships, the Free French Navy could not sail under the tricolour to avoid confusion, and so unlike other navies that flew under their own ensign throughout the war, they had to come up with a new one of their own instead. The Royal Greek, or Hellenic Navy, came into Allied service a little bit later when the Germans decided to rescue the Italian efforts that had been going on trying to invade Greece, and promptly steamrolled right through the place. Having had the advantage of time to prepare, and seeing what other navies had done, the Royal Hellenic Navy promptly grabbed everything the Luftwaffe hadn't already bombed flat and sailed for British bases in the eastern Mediterranean, bringing a number of destroyers, submarines, and other small craft with them, including, of course, the old armoured cruiser Georgios Averof, and presumably with an officer assigned to stand on the stern of each ship and make rude gestures at the oncoming Axis powers the entire way. Much like most of the other navies, they would then supplement their strength with British-built ships and operate under the nominal direction of the British Admiralty, although unlike almost any other free navy, they were able to confine most of their operations to the area near their homeland. The only real exceptions being a few of the destroyers showing up for D-Day, because, let's face it, no one was ever going to miss their chance to have their flag flying over that particular operation, and of course the relocation of the Averof herself to the Indian Ocean for convoy escort duty when her limited speed became too much of a hazard. On the plus side, this meant that the majority of the Royal Hellenic Navy, which eventually reached 44 ships strong, was able to be present for the surrender of the Italian Navy, and something which I imagine must have given them a fair degree of satisfaction, as well as gaining a number of accolades for the work of the Royal Hellenic Navy's destroyers, who were, after all, mostly operating in their own home turf, exemplifying an attitude attributed to them by Winston Churchill, who early in Greece's struggle against Axis invasion had said, "Until now we used to say that the Greeks fought like heroes. Now we shall say the heroes fight like Greeks." Finally, the Royal Yugoslav Navy suffered the misfortune of mostly being either sunk by the Luftwaffe or captured by the Italians, but a few ships did manage to escape. A submarine, 2 motor torpedo boats, and a few aircraft making it out. They would then receive a few small warships on transfer, and, surprisingly, would continue to operate under their own banner, albeit in much the same way as the larger Dutch Navy, with the largest ship allocated to them being the Flower-class corvette HMS Mallow. Unfortunately, due to political tensions between Royal Yugoslav loyalists and partisans operating under Tito, this force was not expanded much beyond this level or size or operational freedom. Overall then, most navies would technically be serving alongside the Royal Navy during the Second World War instead of being incorporated into it, albeit that in most instances their ships were largely British-built and mostly incorporated into the command structure of the British Admiralty within existing British formations, with some of the larger naval forces able to conduct whole formation operations and even a degree of independent action. Generally, this arrangement worked very well thanks to the highly driven nature of the men who served in these forces, who were quite happy to do anything they needed to bring the Axis down. The only major instances of issues arose from the aforementioned conflict between political allegiances in the Yugoslav Navy, a brief socialist revolt in elements of the Hellenic Navy in 1944, and the constant wrangling with de Gaulle to get the Free French to actually work with the Allies' objectives, but that was less of a Free French thing and more of a de Gaulle thing. In most cases, a significant portion of the ships transferred to the various free navies would go on to become the backbone of the post-war navies of the restored countries, with a number of such vessels surviving well into the latter half of the 20th century. The role of these free navies, although individually they might have looked somewhat small, cannot really be overstated. Apart from providing a corps of incredibly highly motivated and brave officers and men, combined, these navies operated well over 250 warships, albeit fair enough, some of them were motor torpedo boats and such, but a fair number of destroyers, a few cruisers, and of course in the Free French's case at least one battleship, were all contributed to the Allied cause, and given that places like the UK were capable of building far more warships than they were able to actually man, the fact that these Free Navy men and officers were present and able to fight meant that the Allied naval effort as a whole was greatly enhanced. And of course, there is the fact that a lot of these people were experienced naval officers and men before the war broke out, which obviously gave them a much higher operational capability compared to somebody who'd enlisted at the start of the war or partway through the war and had had some abbreviated training before being stuck on a ship and told good luck. So that concludes a brief look at the coordination between the Free National Navies and the British Royal Navy, and some of their more notable achievements in helping to defeat the Axis powers in World War II.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.